you are one of the very few academics who have fought against some of these ideas that are not just being promoted, but are being enforced and written into law. And one of them is about gender pronouns. What we mean by gender pronouns is not just he and she, but a whole slew of invented gender pronouns that you're going to be compelled to use.
Yeah, you're already compelled to use, and likely in the States too, even though people don't know it yet. Certainly in New York, and the employment EEOC has already ruled on that with regards to businesses for the U.S. And
yeah, businesses, and I believe also landlords. I think, yeah, so if your landlord chooses to misgender you, and not just misgender you, like if you're a transgender woman, you used to be a man, now you're a woman, and they call you a he. It's not just that. Like, you're compelled to use how many? What is the number of them now?
Well, there's no standard nomenclature for the non-gender or for the non-binary types. There's many, many invented words. And which of those you're supposed to use is dependent entirely on the subjective choice of the person that you're talking with.
Now, most people, I believe, out there listening are going, what the hell are they talking about right now? We're talking about as many as 70 plus invented gender pronouns like Z, XE, ZIR, HIR, a bunch of weird ones. And this is for people that don't necessarily think they're a he or a she. So they prefer these things. On top of that, you have animal kin. Which is
other kin.
Other
including
kin.
worm self, which was the one I found most amusing.
Worm self, fox
I guess
kin.
that's for the low self-esteem otherkins.
This is people that truly believe that they are in the wrong body and that they should have been born some form of animal and would like you to refer to them as this animal.
Or elf.
Or elf. Or fairy.
Or fairy.
I've seen pixie.
Yeah.
Pixie kin.
I haven't seen Pixiekin. That's a good one.
But just get on Tumblr. You got to get on Tumblr.
Right, yes, absolutely.
That's where it all goes down. This person, whoever this professor was, is expert in transgender studies.
Nicholas Matt.
I'm pretty sure that used to be a woman, or she, they. You're not allowed to say that. If you say that, you're a bad person. If you say they. And they and them is the most reasonable of these these alternative pronouns, they and them. Like you could say, if you know a guy and he doesn't know how to swim, they should probably stay out of the pool.
Right, right.
You could say that. You could use that in a non-plural form.
Yes, and they is used to repair awkward sentences, basically.
Yes.
But it's never been used, despite the claims of the gender bender activists. It's never been used for the singular, and we shouldn't give up the distinction.
Language,
we shouldn't give up the distinction between the plural and the singular.
No, it's
ridiculous.
actually
need to know whether it's one person or more than one person.
Do you think it's reasonable for people that are asexual, people that really are uncomfortable with the idea of being a man or a woman? Is it reasonable that we come up with a distinction for that? I mean, that seems like it would be nice, and this is one of the things that you've said. One of the things that you don't like about this is that you're being compelled to use these made-up pronouns, and that if we as a society, as a culture, as a civilization sort of adopt a new phrase, that you would be fine with that.
Well, we kind of had one. We had transsexual.
Yeah, but
I know.
That's problematic because it's not asexual. You know, transsexual would be transition. And here's the other distinction. This is another important thing. Those aren't the people that have the problem with it. The people that have the problem with these pronouns, the transsexual community almost entirely, or at least, I shouldn't say entirely, but predominantly prefer the alternative pronoun.
Yeah, right.
A male to female transgender person prefers to be called a woman or she and use the female pronouns.
It's
male,
the whole point.
Yes.
So, yeah, so there's some tiny
Exactly.
fraction of the transsexual community, or we could say there's some tiny fraction of people who are identifying themselves with the transgender community, which is already a tiny fraction, who claims that they have an identity that doesn't fit into either binary category.
Right.
And well, it's a proposition that I think bears some scrutiny to begin with, because I don't believe that the claims that that tiny community is making are coherent in any sense, because they say, well, you could be man, woman, or neither, or both. Those aren't coherent claims in my estimation. And if what they're saying is we don't fit into a category, and therefore we get to invent our own plurality of categories. It's not logically tenable. That isn't how it works, because you get an infinite number of categories out of that. And that's what's happening already online.
One of my favorite stories came out of an all-girls university in Massachusetts, where a group of women, where they were trying to pick a president of the student body or whatever, and one of the girls who went to that school decided that she identified as a man, so she changed her name. And I don't believe there was any hormones or anything involved. I think she just changed her name. She called herself masculine of center, genderqueer, changed her name to a masculine name, ran for president of whatever the hell this is.
I think it was Wellesley.
Won. Yes, I believe you're right. Won, and then was denounced by the rest of the class because now she was a white male, so she was a part of the patriarchy, and she was a part of the whole problem with society, and that she should not be allowed, or he should not be allowed to take that position, which
well, that's a really good example.
We read it on air, and I couldn't stop laughing.
Right. Well, that's a really good example of the chaos that ensues when you start to blow apart standard categories. There's a chaos in between categories that's made of an infinite multiplicity. That's why you see, too, with the LGBT rainbow, they're getting caught in their own metaphor. So there's an infinite number of gradations in a rainbow, and there's an infinite number of letters that are accumulating on the LGBT rainbow. And there's an element of clear absurdity to that. And one of them is, I believe it's Q+, that includes the other kin types. It's like... Well, the claim is, well, I'm marginalized, and then that sort of becomes normalized, and then there's a group right outside of that says, well, I'm marginalized too, and another group says, well, I'm also marginalized. And there's absolutely no logic. Once you've identified yourself as marginalized, there's no logical way that you can exclude anyone else who regards themselves as marginalized. And so the marginalized... The community of the marginalized expands and expands and expands and expands. And part of the reason for that is that every individual is a multiplicity. And there's an element to every individual that's marginalized. You know, so for example, it's clearly the case that when a child is socialized, there's pros and cons to that. The pros are, the socialization turns the little beastly 2-year-old into a 4-year-old that other children can play with. And that does happen between the ages of 2 and 4 if a child is socialized properly. And then what the child does is kind of turn into a clone of everyone else so that he or she can benefit from being able to interact with everyone else. Now, that builds up a certain amount of individuality because kids learn to talk and they learn to play and all that. And it destroys a certain amount of individuality. So everybody sacrifices a certain portion of their peculiarity to become a socialized creature. And some of that's good and some of it's bad. And we know that. That's the standard story of the rebellious adolescent against society for crushing their individuality, right? And there's an element of that that's true. But by the same token, if you don't sacrifice a certain amount of your individuality to the group, there's no such thing as society. Everybody has to live on their own. Everyone is in their own subjective bubble, which is, of course, now required by this law. And society itself breaks down. And so you can't have a society without marginalizing people, or you can't have a society without making everyone, part of everyone, marginalized. And so then when you start to concentrate on the marginalized, it just grows and expands and grows and expands and grows and expands until everyone becomes marginalized.
And that just highlights a real problem with quote mining. That someone is going to take that, you can't have a society without marginalizing people, quote, and put it under Dr. Jordan Peterson, this is what he believes.
Right, well, that's actually what Jacques Derrida said, the most famous of the postmodernists. That's why Derrida is such a invasive force. He said, well, you can't have a society without marginalizing. It's like, well, that's true. It's true, comma, but, ... right? But the fact that you can't have a society without marginalizing doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a society. And it doesn't mean that the only reason that society exists is to marginalize. And that was Derrida's claim. That's what makes him so... He's absolutely pathological to the core, Jacques Derrida. And apart from his claims that all we do is trade power games, because that's another one of his claims. His other claim is that the purpose of categorization, the purpose of society, is to marginalize. And that's absolutely absurd. The purpose is so that we can all play a moderately mediocre but productive, homogenous social game. Is it perfect? Well, obviously not. Does it require the sacrifice of individuality? Yes. Is some of that sacrificed individuality valuable? Absolutely. What's the alternative? No society. Well, I don't think so. That doesn't seem like a very good alternative to me. Or maybe some sort of egalitarian utopia. Well, yeah, we had 100 years of that, and 100 million deaths as a consequence. And so maybe not that either. What we have right now is a flawed system. But it's the best flawed system that anybody's ever come up with. And of course it marginalizes people. How could it not? You know, if kids organize themselves in a playground to play hide and go seek, they've marginalized all the kids that wanted to play tag. Obviously. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't come to a consensus and go ahead and play a game. At least they're bloody well playing a game that you know, pretty much everybody has access to.